Unveiling sin, did we get Genesis 3 all wrong? What if everything you were told about the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 was based on a mistranslation? What if the word sin wasn't even in the story of Adam and Eve? What? Isn't Genesis 3 where sin entered the world? Actually, no. The Hebrew word for sin, chatta'ah, never appears in Genesis 3, not once. So if that's the case, where does the Bible first mention sin? It shows up in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. When God warns Cain, sin is crouching at your door, its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And that word, it's chatta'ah. It doesn't mean rebellion, it doesn't mean depravity, it means to miss the mark, like an archer aiming at a target and falling short. Not cosmic evil, a misstep, a failure to hit the goal. So if sin wasn't mentioned in the garden, then what really happened there? Adam and Eve ate from the tree. That part is clear. But was it open defiance, or was it curiosity, a mistake, a lapse in judgment? If it were rebellion, wouldn't the Bible say so plainly? But it doesn't. Instead, the story focuses on something else, their response. When God asks, "Where are you?" Do you really think he didn't know? Of course he did. That question wasn't about geography, it was about relationship, about connection. And how did Adam respond? He hides. Then he blames, "It's the woman you gave me." Not just blaming Eve, but also blaming God. Is that why he was expelled? Because he couldn't own up to his actions? Let's test that idea. Look at Cain. God asks, "Where is your brother?" Cain doesn't confess. He responds with, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Deflection, excuse, and then the curse comes. Now compare that to David. When he sinned with Bathsheba, he didn't blame. He said, "I have sinned before the Lord." No excuses. And what did he receive? Mercy. Or take Saul. God tells him to destroy the Amalekites. He doesn't. When confronted, he says, "I spared the best for sacrifice." Excuses, blame, and the result? The kingdom is stripped from him. See the pattern? It's not always the action that brings judgment, it's the response. It's the refusal to take responsibility. And that brings us back to Adam. God says, "Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat from?" A moment for honesty, a moment for confession. But Adam shifts the blame, and that's when the consequences roll in. Not because he failed, but because he wouldn't own it. So let's ask, was humanity cursed because of sin? Or because of pride, fear, and denial? And if sin, according to Genesis chapter 4, means missing the mark, then maybe the story isn't about how we were doomed forever, but how we began learning accountability. A first misstep, not an eternal stain. And if we were truly born inherently sinful, here's a question. Why don't children who die go to hell? If we're all born guilty, wouldn't they be guilty too? But Scripture gives us a different picture. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, God says the little ones have no knowledge of good and evil. And in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23, after David's infant son dies, he says, "He will not return to me, but I shall go to him." David clearly believed the child was with God. So again, are we really born sinful, or are we born human, capable of learning, choosing, missing the mark, and starting over? Centuries later, something shifts. A man named Augustine of Hippo starts wrestling with Genesis 3, but he's not reading it in Hebrew, he's reading it in Latin, specifically the Vulgate, a translation completed by Jerome around the year 405 AD. And this is where it gets crucial. The Hebrew word for sin is chatta'ah, which means to miss the mark. It paints the picture of a mistake, an error in aim, something that can be corrected. But Jerome translates it into the Latin word peccatum, and peccatum, that's a very different idea. It comes from a Latin root meaning misdeed, offense, or crime. Not just a mistake, but a violation, something that carries legal and moral weight. Guilt, blame, condemnation. So now, instead of Adam and Eve missing the mark, we have them committing a crime against God. But here's something we can't afford to ignore, that Hebrew word chatta'ah. It's never in Genesis 3. Let that sink in. The entire story of Adam and Eve, eating the fruit, hiding, covering themselves, facing God, it never uses the word sin. Not once. So where did the idea that sin entered the world even come from? Let's rewind. Look closely at the Hebrew text, and you'll find words about disobedience, about hiding, about fear, but not about sin as we understand it today. No chatta'ah, no inherited corruption, no moral contamination, and in other parts of Scripture, when disobedience is called chatta'ah, God's response isn't always condemnation. Often, it's correction, restoration, a second chance. So what changed? Augustine reads Peccatum, and from that he builds a theology, original sin. The idea that Adam's mistake didn't just affect him, it infected all of us. That from birth, we carry guilt, shame, condemnation. But that theology didn't come from the Hebrew, it came from the Latin, layer by layer, Hebrew to Greek, Greek to Latin, each translation adding more weight, more permanence, more shame. And from there, the idea sticks. Theologians double down. Translators choose the word sin. Artists paint shame on every face. Preachers tell us we're born broken. But when we go back to the original story, what do we actually find? Not a humanity cursed by one act, but a humanity given choice. Not shame as default, but accountability as invitation. Not inherited guilt, but the possibility of return. So maybe the fall of man wasn't the moment we lost everything. Maybe it was the moment we were asked the most important question, where are you? And how we answer, that's what changes everything. Maybe the fall wasn't the end of innocence. Maybe it was the beginning of responsibility. And maybe we've spent too long telling people they're born broken, when the real message was always this: you can choose better, you can return, you can grow. Share your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe for more revelations like this.